Greenbrier Valley, Western Virginia, 1842. While every experienced frontiersman split red oak into standard roof shakes at a sensible 30-degree pitch, Welsh immigrant Rhys Morgan was measuring a 50-degree angle against his cabin's ridgepole, nearly twice as steep as proper construction demanded. His neighbors watched him cut 400 oak shakes instead of the usual 250, then layer birch bark beneath them like he was expecting Noah's flood. Local master builder Samuel Hutchins, who'd roofed 40 cabins in 15 years, called it wasteful. They called Morgan a fool. He was using 3 times the timber he needed, spending $12 extra, nearly a month's income, on a roof so steep that squirrels would slide right off. Then the winter of 1843 arrived. The wettest year in recorded history. 8 inches of rain in March, 7 more in April, nearly 10 in June. By January, the great storm hit. 3 days of freezing rain, 2 feet of snow, then torrential downpours. Standard roofs collapsed under saturated snow. William Crawford's cabin roof caved in completely. 7 families abandoned their homes entirely. But that fool's steep roof? It stayed bone dry while 13 people sheltered inside, watching rain drum against the angled shakes and flow away like water off a mountainside. What did this Welsh immigrant understand about water, angles, and survival that every experienced American builder had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The morning mist clung to the Greenbrier Valley hollows as Rhys Morgan positioned his handplane against the ridgepole, shaving curls of yellow poplar that caught the October light like spun gold. His Welsh accent carried across the clearing as he called measurements to his teenage son David, who marked each rafter location with precise chalk lines. 42 years old and built like the slate quarry workers of his homeland, Morgan moved with the deliberate confidence of a man who had learned construction in mountains where mistakes meant death. William Crawford approached through the morning fog, his boots crunching through fallen leaves as he studied Morgan's half-completed cabin frame. The steep angle of the roof rafters struck him immediately. They rose at what appeared to be nearly twice the pitch of every other cabin in the hollow. Crawford had helped raise 17 structures since settling in Western Virginia, and he knew proper construction when he saw it. This wasn't it. "Rhys, that angle's going to waste half your materials," Crawford called out, gesturing toward the rafters that stretched toward the sky like the ribs of some enormous beast. "Every experienced builder knows 30 degrees gives you the best balance of shedding and economy." Morgan paused his planing and wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "In the Cambrian Mountains, William, my father taught me that water won't wait for permission to enter your home. 50 degrees means the rain touches each shake for half the time it would on your roof." Crawford shook his head. Calculating the waste in his mind, Morgan's steep pitch would require at least 30% more rafters, 30% more roof decking, and significantly more shakes to cover the expanded surface area. The mathematics of frontier construction were ruthless. Every board meant hours with a crosscut saw. Every shake required splitting by hand from carefully selected oak logs. Samuel Hutchins arrived as the 2 men continued their discussion, his tool bag slung over his shoulder and his expression already skeptical. At 57, Hutchins commanded respect throughout the region as the hollow's master builder. His weathered hands had shaped more cabins than any man within 50 miles, and his reputation rested on efficient, economical construction that served families adequately without bankrupting them in materials and labor. "That Welshman's building like he expects the end times," Hutchins announced, studying Morgan's rafter arrangement with the critical eye of an expert. "I've roofed 40 cabins with standard pitch, and they've served their families just fine. This contraption will cost him $12 extra in materials alone, money that could feed a family through winter." Morgan continued his work, seemingly immune to the criticism. He had calculated his material needs with the precision of a man whose survival depended on mathematics. 400 oak shakes instead of the standard 250. Each shake would measure exactly 2 feet long, 6 inches wide, and 3/8 inch thick, identical to conventional shakes but arranged according to the triple overlap system his father had learned from generations of Welsh mountain builders. The conversation drew other settlers from their morning tasks. James Whitmore paused his corn shucking to observe the discussion, while Thomas Bradley left his horse shoeing to examine Morgan's unusual construction. Word traveled quickly in frontier communities, and Morgan's roof was becoming the hollow's primary topic of conversation. "Look at those rafters," Bradley commented, running his hand along the steep timber. "He's using 20% more lumber than necessary, and for what? Rain's the same whether it hits at 30 degrees or 50 degrees. Morgan climbed down from his work platform and faced the growing crowd of neighbors. His hands, stained dark from years of working with pitch and timber, gestured toward the surrounding mountains where morning clouds caught on the ridgelines like wool on thorns. "You see those peaks?" he asked, his voice carrying the certainty of experience. "They shed water because they're steep. Gentle slopes hold water. Steep slopes shed it. My father worked slate quarries where 60 inches of rain fell every year. The roofs that survived weren't the economical ones. They were the ones built to handle the worst weather the mountains could deliver." Hutchins stepped forward, his authority as the region's master builder evident in his posture. "Reese, I respect your old country ways, but this is Virginia, not Wales. We get maybe 35 inches of rain in a good year. Your father's methods are excessive for our conditions." The crowd murmured agreement. Frontier logic demanded efficiency above all else. Every extra hour spent on construction was an hour not spent clearing fields, hunting game, or preparing winter supplies. Morgan's insistence on overbuilding struck them as the stubborn pride of a man who refused to adapt to American realities. Morgan returned to his work, positioning the next rafter with careful attention to spacing and angle. His movements demonstrated the muscle memory of traditional craftsmanship, techniques passed down through generations of Welsh mountain builders who had learned their trade in conditions that demanded perfection or promised death. "Mark my words," Hutchins announced to the assembled neighbors, his voice carrying the authority of 15 years' successful building experience. "Come spring, that roof will shed water so fast it'll erode the ground around his foundation. And all winter, he'll be heating airspace that serves no purpose except satisfying his stubborn Welsh pride." The neighbors dispersed to their daily tasks, shaking their heads at Morgan's waste of good materials. Crawford lingered longest, watching the Welsh immigrant work with obvious skill, despite his questionable judgment. The precision of Morgan's measurements impressed him even as the expense troubled his practical frontier sensibilities. As autumn progressed, Morgan's cabin took shape according to his exacting standards. The roof deck received birch bark sheeting, carefully overlapped and sealed with pine pitch, another unnecessary expense that drew continued commentary from passing neighbors. His shake installation followed the mysterious triple overlap pattern that consumed far more materials than conventional methods while serving no apparent purpose that frontier logic could understand. By November, Morgan's cabin stood complete, its impossibly steep roof towering over neighboring structures like a wooden mountain. The community's mockery had crystallized into resigned acceptance of their Welsh neighbors' expensive eccentricities. Samuel Hutchins calculated the final material waste at nearly $15, money that could have purchased a milk cow or 6 months of cornmeal for a growing family. Winter approached with the usual frontier preparations, but Morgan's neighbors had already rendered their verdict on his construction methods. The steep roof would prove impractical, the excessive materials wasted, and the Welsh immigrant's stubborn adherence to old country ways an expensive lesson in American frontier reality. The knowledge that guided Morgan's seemingly wasteful construction had been forged in the Cambrian mountains of Wales, where his father Evan worked the Penrhyn slate quarries, and survival depended on understanding water's relentless physics. In those rain-soaked highlands, where annual precipitation exceeded 60 inches and Atlantic storms drove horizontal sheets of water against any vertical surface, traditional Welsh builders had developed roofing systems that treated water as an enemy requiring multiple lines of defense rather than a simple nuisance to be deflected. Evan Morgan had apprenticed under master roofers whose families had weatherproofed mountain structures for 3 centuries. Learning that water's greatest vulnerability lay in its inability to penetrate surfaces it could not touch for extended periods. The fundamental principle underlying Welsh mountain construction recognized that rain falling on steep surfaces achieved velocities that minimized contact time with roofing materials, reducing opportunities for penetration through inevitable gaps and joints that developed as wood aged and weather cycles stressed every connection. The triple overlap system that Rees now implemented in the Virginia Hollow represented generations of refined Welsh engineering designed specifically for extreme precipitation conditions. Unlike American frontier practice that relied on single-point overlap, one shake covering the joint between 2 shakes below it, Welsh methods created 3 separate barriers at every potential water entry point. The bottom shake in each course extended 8 inches beyond the shake directly beneath it, providing the primary deflection surface. The middle shake covered 6 inches of the bottom shake while extending 6 inches beyond it, creating a secondary barrier that caught water penetrating the first line. The top shake covered 4 inches of the middle shake, forming a third barrier that protected against the rare water droplets that somehow navigated the first 2 obstacles. This seemingly excessive system recognized a fundamental reality that frontier builders ignored. Wood moved, split, and warped as moisture content changed with seasons, creating gaps that allowed water penetration in single overlap systems. The Welsh triple overlap meant that even when individual shakes developed splits or warped away from their neighbors, 2 additional barriers remained functional, maintaining weatherproof integrity that single overlap systems could not match once wood aging began. The birch bark installation beneath Morgan's oak shakes served as what modern construction would recognize as a secondary weather barrier, essentially a backup roof designed to function when the primary system experienced localized failures. Welsh builders had learned that organic materials like bark possessed waterproof qualities that complemented rather than competed with wood shakes, creating redundant protection systems that acknowledged the inevitability of primary barrier failure over time. Morgan's birch bark sheets, each measuring 4 feet by 2 feet and overlapped by 4 inches at every joint, formed a continuous membrane sealed with pine pitch, heated to precise viscosity for optimal penetration into bark fibers. The installation required positioning each sheet to direct any water that penetrated the shake system toward the roof edges rather than allowing it to pool or drip into the cabin interior. The pitch sealing, applied while still warm enough to flow but cool enough to avoid bark damage, created waterproof joints that remained flexible through freeze-thaw cycles that made rigid seals brittle and prone to failure. The physics underlying Morgan's 50-degree roof pitch reflected mathematical principles that Welsh mountain builders had understood intuitively long before engineering textbooks quantified water velocity relationships. At conventional 30-degree angles, rainwater traveled across shake surfaces at approximately 1.5 feet per second, providing sufficient contact time for water to find and exploit small gaps between shakes or work into the grain structure of aging wood. Morgan's 50-degree pitch accelerated water flow to nearly 3 feet per second, reducing contact time by 60% and dramatically decreasing opportunities for water penetration through any gaps in the primary roofing system. The steep angle also prevented snow accumulation beyond 6 inches depth, eliminating the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed conventional frontier roofs when accumulated snow melted during warm periods and refroze during cold snaps. Ice formation in roof gaps created expansion forces that split shakes and opened joints, allowing subsequent precipitation to penetrate into cabin interiors where it damaged stored supplies and created health-threatening dampness that promoted respiratory illness during long winter confinements. Morgan's material calculations reflected the long-term economics of superior construction rather than the short-term savings that attracted frontier builders focused on immediate shelter needs. His roof required 400 oak shakes compared to 250 for conventional construction, plus 180 square feet of birch bark, 50 pounds of pine pitch, and 20% additional roof decking lumber. The total additional investment of $12 represented significant expense for frontier families. But Welsh experience had taught that superior construction paid for itself through reduced maintenance costs and extended service life. Traditional Welsh roofs built using Morgan's methods typically served 18 to 20 years without major repairs, while American frontier roofs required complete replacement every 4 to 6 years due to weather damage and material failure. The annual cost analysis strongly favored initial investment in superior materials and techniques. Morgan's roof cost approximately 60 cents per year of service, while conventional roofing requiring regular replacement cost 75 cents annually when repair and replacement expenses were calculated over typical frontier cabin lifespans. The knowledge gap between Welsh mountain building traditions and American frontier practice reflected different environmental pressures and cultural priorities. American settlers, focused on rapid expansion and immediate adequacy, had developed construction methods optimized for speed and material conservation rather than long-term performance under extreme conditions. Welsh builders, working in harsh mountain climates where inadequate shelter meant death, had refined techniques that prioritized absolute weather resistance regardless of initial material investment. Morgan's neighbors saw waste where Welsh tradition recognized investment. The additional shakes, the birch bark membrane, the steep pitch requiring extra rafters, every element that frontier logic condemned as excessive, served specific functions in a comprehensive weatherproofing system designed to protect human life and property under conditions that tested construction methods to their ultimate limits. As December snow began falling on the Greenbrier Valley, Morgan's completed roof demonstrated its mountain heritage with every storm. Snow slid cleanly from the steep surface, while neighboring roofs accumulated dangerous loads. Ice could not form in joints that shed water too quickly for freezing to occur. The triple overlap system and birch bark backing created weatherproof integrity that remained constant regardless of individual shake movement or aging. The first winter storms would soon test every roof in the hollow, but only Morgan understood that his seemingly wasteful construction represented 3 centuries of Welsh mountain wisdom refined through generations of builders who had learned that adequate was never sufficient when survival hung in the balance. March 1843 delivered the first warning of what meteorologists would later classify as a 100-year weather event. John Alderson, the Hollow's postmaster and meticulous weather observer, recorded 8.3 inches of precipitation during a month that typically received 4 inches. His daily measurements, carefully noted in a leather-bound ledger that served as the region's unofficial weather record, showed persistent rainfall patterns unlike anything in his 15 years of systematic observation. The saturated ground could not absorb the relentless moisture. Creek beds that normally carried clear mountain water turned muddy brown with erosion runoff. Hillside springs emerged where none had existed during previous seasons, creating unexpected drainage problems for cabins positioned according to normal water flow patterns. The extra moisture stressed frontier construction in ways that dry years had never revealed. Samuel Hutchins discovered the first signs of trouble in early April when he noticed dark stains spreading across the interior wall of his own cabin near the roofline. The discoloration appeared gradually, beginning as barely visible shadows that deepened into pronounced watermarks over successive rain events. The leak was not catastrophic flooding, but persistent moisture penetration that accumulated over time, creating conditions that threatened stored grain supplies and promoted wood rot in structural timbers. The standard frontier response involved climbing onto the wet, slippery roof surface to locate the source of water entry and attempt temporary repairs. Hutchins spent 2 afternoons in late April wedging thin wood chips between shakes where gaps had developed, sealing suspected leak points with pine pitch mixed with wood ash, and adjusting shake positions to improve overlap coverage. The repairs appeared successful during dry periods, but failed consistently when heavy rains returned. 3 other families in the hollow reported similar problems by early May. William Crawford noticed musty odors in his cabin that indicated moisture accumulation in concealed spaces where air circulation could not prevent mold growth. Thomas Bradley's wife complained of dampness in their sleeping area that made bedding uncomfortable and contributed to respiratory congestion among their children. James Whitmore discovered water damage to his precious seed corn stored in leather bags near the cabin's interior wall. The community initially attributed these problems to the unusual spring weather rather than examining potential construction inadequacies. Frontier logic suggested that exceptional precipitation would stress even well-built structures, and the settlers convinced themselves that normal weather patterns would vindicate their traditional building methods. The mindset reflected a common cognitive bias, explaining away evidence that challenged established beliefs rather than questioning the validity of those beliefs. Morgan's cabin remained completely dry throughout the spring deluge. Neighbors who visited to borrow tools or seek assistance with their leaking roofs could not help but notice the absence of musty odors that characterized cabins experiencing moisture problems. The interior air quality remained fresh and comfortable, despite the persistent exterior dampness that plagued every other structure in the hollow. Morgan's grain storage showed no signs of moisture damage. His interior walls displayed no water stains, and he spent no time performing roof repairs while his neighbors climbed dangerous wet surfaces weekly. June 1843 brought unprecedented precipitation levels that transformed the weather crisis from unusual to historic. Alderson's measurements recorded 9.7 inches of rainfall during a month that typically received 3.5 inches. The combination of excessive moisture and summer heat created ideal conditions for accelerated wood deterioration as wet lumber expanded and contracted with temperature fluctuations that stressed every joint and connection in conventional roof systems. 7 families now reported significant roofing problems that interfered with daily life and threatened winter food storage. Crawford moved his family's sleeping arrangements twice as leaks developed in new locations faster than repairs could address them. The Whitmore cabin leaked so persistently that they placed wooden buckets strategically throughout the interior to catch drips, creating a percussion symphony during nighttime rainstorms that disrupted sleep and frayed nerves already stressed by damp living conditions. The community's response shifted from confident optimism to resigned acceptance of circumstances beyond their control. Rather than questioning their construction methods, the settlers adapted their lifestyles to accommodate leaking roofs as an inevitable consequence of exceptional weather. They moved valuable possessions away from known leak points, positioned containers to catch interior drips, and accepted dampness as a temporary inconvenience that would resolve when normal precipitation patterns returned. Hutchins, whose reputation as the Hollow's master builder, was increasingly challenged by the widespread roof failures, maintained that the wet year represented an unprecedented anomaly that would not repeat. He argued that traditional construction methods had served the region adequately for decades and would prove sufficient once the exceptional weather cycle ended. This rationalization protected his professional standing while avoiding the uncomfortable admission that his techniques might be inadequate for extreme conditions. Morgan watched these developments with growing concern for his neighbors' health and safety. Welsh mountain experience had taught him that persistent dampness in living spaces created respiratory problems that could prove fatal during winter months when families remained confined indoors for extended periods. The mold growth and air quality deterioration he observed in neighboring cabins represented serious threats to community health that conventional frontier construction was proving incapable of addressing. September delivered another 6.2 inches of precipitation, bringing the year's total to levels that exceeded Alderson's weather records by more than 40%. By October, 9 of 12 cabins in the hollow leaked regularly enough to require daily management of interior water collection. Families had reorganized their living spaces around leak locations, sleeping in corners that remained dry and cooking in areas where dripping water could not contaminate food preparation surfaces. The psychological impact of chronic dampness affected community morale as settlers faced the approaching winter knowing their shelters could not provide adequate weather protection. Children developed persistent coughs attributed to damp air quality. Adults complained of joint stiffness that worsened during rainy periods. The accumulated stress of managing leaking roofs while maintaining frontier subsistence activities created community tension that manifested in shortened tempers and decreased cooperation on communal tasks. Morgan's cabin continued performing flawlessly as winter approached, but his neighbors no longer attributed this success to luck or temporary advantages. The consistent superiority of his roof's performance throughout the wettest year in recorded history began undermining their confidence in traditional construction methods. Samuel Hutchins found himself studying Morgan's steep roof angle with new interest, though professional pride prevented him from openly acknowledging the Welsh immigrant's superior techniques. As December snow began falling on saturated ground and stressed roof structures throughout the Greenbrier Valley, the Hollow's residents prepared for winter in shelters already compromised by months of water damage. They had stockpiled extra firewood to compensate for heat loss through gaps and dampness, moved winter supplies to areas offering maximum protection from leaks, and resigned themselves to enduring several months of uncomfortable living conditions while hoping their damaged roofs would survive until spring repairs became possible. December brought atmospheric conditions that modern meteorologists would recognize as a perfect storm convergence, a collision of Arctic air masses with warm, moisture-laden systems from the Gulf of Mexico that created the weather phenomenon frontier communities simply called the Destroyer. The crisis began December 28th when freezing rain encased every surface in the Greenbrier Valley with a crystalline armor that transformed familiar landscapes into treacherous ice sculptures, reflecting winter sunlight like scattered diamonds. The temperature oscillation proved catastrophic for conventional roof construction. Ice formation in the gaps between shakes created expansion forces equivalent to iron wedges driven by invisible hammers. Oak wood that had served adequately during normal freeze-thaw cycles split along the grain like kindling under an axe when ice crystals expanded with mathematical precision inside every microscopic gap that months of moisture penetration had created. The sounds of splitting wood echoed across the hollow throughout the night, as roofs that had leaked gradually during autumn suddenly developed gaping wounds that exposed cabin interiors to the full fury of mountain weather. William Crawford awakened January 2nd to discover water pooling beneath his sleeping area where ceiling gaps had opened during the night. The leak was no longer the manageable dripping that had characterized autumn problems, but a steady stream that soaked bedding and threatened the family's winter clothing stores. His attempts to position containers proved futile as multiple leak points developed faster than available pots and buckets could accommodate them. 2 feet of snow fell during the first week of January, settling onto roofs already compromised by ice damage and creating loads that frontier construction had never been designed to bear. The weight calculations were merciless. Each square foot of roof surface now supported 30 pounds of saturated snow compared to the 8 pounds of dry snow that conventional structures could handle safely. Roof rafters that had seemed adequately sized during construction now groaned audibly under loads approaching their structural limits. Samuel Hutchins faced the professional humiliation of watching his own craftsmanship fail catastrophically. The cabin he had built for his family using 15 years of accumulated frontier expertise now leaked in 17 different locations that he had carefully mapped and numbered in a desperate attempt to manage the crisis. His wife, Sarah, moved their sleeping area 3 times during the first 2 weeks of January, chasing dry spots that disappeared as quickly as she could reorganize their living space around them. The Whitmore family confronted disaster when their roof began sagging visibly under snow load on January 12th. The center ridgeline dropped nearly 4 inches as supporting rafters bent beyond their elastic limits, creating a pronounced bow that threatened complete structural collapse. Thomas Whitmore spent exhausting hours climbing onto his dangerous roof to shovel snow during each storm, knowing that accumulated weight could bring the entire structure down on his sleeping family. January 15th delivered the climactic destruction when rapid warming following heavy snowfall created conditions that overwhelmed every damaged roof simultaneously. Temperatures rose from 15 degrees below zero to 45 degrees above in 18 hours, transforming solid snow into torrents of meltwater that cascaded through roof gaps with the volume and pressure of temporary waterfalls. William Crawford's roof partially collapsed when waterlogged rafters could no longer support their load, sending a section of roof decking crashing into the cabin interior where it destroyed stored grain supplies and damaged furniture his family could not afford to replace. Dr. Benjamin Price's medical records documented the human cost of inadequate shelter during the crisis period. 3 families developed respiratory infections that he attributed directly to prolonged exposure to damp, cold air in compromised cabins. Children showed symptoms of chest congestion that worsened during periods of intense interior dampness, while adults complained of joint pain and persistent fatigue that Price recognized as early signs of rheumatic conditions associated with chronic cold and moisture exposure. The community's survival instincts overcame pride and prejudice as the crisis deepened. Morgan's 24 by 16-foot cabin became an unofficial emergency shelter where neighbors sought refuge during the worst weather periods. The stark contrast between interior conditions became undeniable when 13 people crowded into Morgan's dry, warm space while their own cabins offered neither comfort nor safety. Temperature measurements taken during peak crisis conditions revealed the mathematical relationship between roof performance and interior habitability. Morgan's cabin maintained 68 degrees Fahrenheit, while neighboring structures struggled to achieve 55 degrees despite consuming significantly more firewood. The dry air in Morgan's cabin heated efficiently and retained warmth effectively, while damp air in leaking cabins required substantially more fuel energy to achieve inferior results. Morgan's firewood consumption during the crisis winter totaled 12 cords compared to the 18 cords consumed by families heating moisture-laden air in compromised cabins. The 33% efficiency improvement resulted directly from heating dry air that held and distributed warmth naturally, rather than wasting fuel energy on evaporating interior moisture that leaked roofs continuously introduced into living spaces. The psychological impact of sheltering in superior conditions while witnessing the failure of conventional construction methods transformed community attitudes toward Morgan's techniques. Neighbors who had mocked his excessive preparation 6 months earlier now experienced firsthand the life-saving difference between adequate and superior construction. Samuel Hutchins, the master builder whose authority had seemed unshakable, found himself asking detailed questions about overlap patterns, pitch angles, and waterproofing methods he had previously dismissed as wasteful. James Whitmore's family abandoned their collapsing cabin entirely on January 20th, moving in with relatives whose roof remained partially functional. The complete loss of their shelter during peak winter represented the ultimate failure of construction methods that had seemed adequate during normal weather years. Their abandoned cabin served as a visible reminder throughout the remaining winter months that frontier construction standards were insufficient for the extreme conditions that periodically tested mountain communities. The Crawford family's partial roof collapse required emergency repairs that consumed their carefully hoarded winter cash reserves. William spent $48 on replacement lumber and emergency construction labor, 4 times Morgan's initial investment in superior materials, while achieving repairs that barely restored basic weather protection rather than solving underlying construction inadequacies. By February, the mockery that had characterized community attitudes toward Morgan's methods had transformed into respectful inquiry about techniques that had proven their worth under conditions that revealed the fatal weaknesses of conventional frontier construction. The Welsh immigrant who had been considered a fool for wasting materials now represented the difference between survival and catastrophe when mountain weather tested construction methods to their breaking points. Morgan's cabin emerged from the crisis winter without requiring any repairs, demonstrating zero structural damage despite sheltering multiple families during the worst weather conditions in local memory. The roof that neighbors had called excessive had performed exactly as Welsh mountain tradition predicted, not merely adequately, but with the comfortable margin of safety that meant the difference between survival and disaster when frontier communities faced nature's ultimate tests. Spring 1844 transformed the Greenbrier Valley into a construction laboratory where theoretical knowledge met practical necessity. Samuel Hutchins arrived at Morgan's cabin on March 15th, carrying his leather-bound notebook and a new humility forged by winter's harsh lessons. The master builder who had dismissed Welsh techniques as wasteful now sketched detailed diagrams of Morgan's triple overlap system, measuring angles with his carpenter's square and asking questions that revealed the depth of his professional ignorance. "Show me how you calculated that pitch angle," Hutchins requested. positioning his measuring tools against Morgan's rafters with the careful attention of a student rather than the confident authority of an established expert. I need to understand the mathematics behind water velocity before I rebuild the Henderson cabin. Morgan demonstrated the principles with quiet patience, explaining how 50-degree angles created water speeds that eliminated penetration opportunities conventional pitches provided. He guided Hutchins through birch bark installation techniques, emphasizing the critical importance of overlap direction and pine pitch viscosity that determined waterproof integrity. The knowledge transfer represented a cultural shift from dismissive skepticism to desperate adoption of proven superior methods. William Crawford began his own reconstruction project in early April, investing his remaining winter savings in materials that would implement Morgan's techniques on his damaged cabin. The cost calculations were sobering: $45 for complete roof replacement using Welsh methods versus $28 for conventional repairs that would likely fail during the next severe weather cycle. Crawford chose long-term protection over short-term economy, recognizing that adequate construction had nearly cost his family their lives. Word of Morgan's vindication traveled through Appalachian trading networks with the speed of vital survival information. Circuit-riding Methodist minister Jonathan Hayes carried detailed descriptions of Welsh roofing techniques to settlements throughout Western Virginia, describing construction methods that had saved lives during the worst winter in regional memory. His sermons increasingly included practical building advice alongside spiritual guidance, recognizing that proper shelter served God's work by preserving the lives entrusted to his pastoral care. The technical revolution spread beyond individual reconstruction projects to influence regional building standards. County surveyor Marcus Webb incorporated steep pitch specifications into his official cabin certification requirements, mandating 45-degree minimum angles for structures claiming weather-resistant construction. The legal recognition of superior building standards reflected growing awareness that frontier adequacy was insufficient for periodic extreme weather events that tested every aspect of mountain survival. Thomas Bradley documented the economic transformation in his merchant ledger, recording dramatic increases in birch bark sales and specialty roofing materials as settlers throughout the region adopted Welsh techniques. His trading post became an informal education center where builders exchanged information about proper overlap ratios, pitch calculations, and waterproofing methods that Morgan had introduced to American frontier construction. Dr. Benjamin Price's medical records showed measurable health improvements as families moved into properly constructed shelters. Respiratory infections decreased by 60% during the winter of 1844 through 45 compared to the previous year's crisis period. Children's persistent coughs disappeared when damp living conditions were eliminated through superior roof construction. The correlation between building quality and community health became undeniable as Welsh techniques proved their medical as well as structural benefits. Regional insurance assessor Henry Morrison adjusted premium calculations to reflect the superior longevity of structures built using Morgan's methods. Cabins incorporating steep pitches, triple overlap systems, and birch bark backing qualified for 20% reduced rates based on demonstrated resistance to weather damage. The financial recognition of construction quality created economic incentives that accelerated adoption of Welsh techniques beyond their practical survival advantages. Agricultural Extension Agent David Palmer included roofing construction techniques in his official recommendations to frontier farmers, recognizing that crop storage required absolutely reliable weather protection to prevent catastrophic food losses. His printed circulars, distributed throughout Virginia and neighboring states, featured detailed diagrams of Morgan's overlap systems and pitch calculations that transformed local knowledge into regional standard practice. The Tennessee Valley Authority's 1850 Architectural Survey documented the widespread adoption of Welsh techniques throughout Appalachian settlements, noting that structures built using Morgan's methods during the 1840s showed dramatically superior survival rates compared to conventional construction of the same period. 47 cabins incorporating steep pitches and triple overlap systems remained structurally sound after 15 years, while only 12 conventional structures from the same construction period survived without major repairs or complete reconstruction. Professional builders throughout the region began advertising their familiarity with mountain roofing methods as a competitive advantage that justified premium pricing for superior construction services. Master carpenter advertisements in Virginia, newspapers specifically mentioned Welsh overlap techniques and steep pitch capabilities, recognizing that consumers now understood the relationship between construction quality and family safety during severe weather periods. The knowledge preservation efforts began in 1851, when Virginia Historical Society researcher Amanda Clark interviewed Morgan extensively about Welsh building traditions and their adaptation to American frontier conditions. Her detailed documentation captured not only construction techniques, but also the cultural resistance Morgan had faced and the dramatic vindication that transformed community attitudes toward immigrant knowledge systems. Educational institutions incorporated practical building science into their curricula as the relationship between construction quality and community survival became mathematically demonstrable. Virginia Military Institute's engineering program included modules on traditional roofing techniques alongside modern architectural theory, recognizing that indigenous and immigrant knowledge often surpassed contemporary American building standards in specific environmental applications. Morgan's original cabin served as a living laboratory where visiting builders studied construction techniques that had proven their worth under extreme conditions. The structure became an unofficial pilgrimage site for serious builders seeking to understand the principles underlying superior weather protection. County records show over 200 documented visits between 1850 and 1860 as Morgan's reputation spread throughout Appalachian building communities. The broader cultural impact extended beyond construction techniques to challenge fundamental assumptions about immigrant knowledge and traditional methods. Morgan's vindication demonstrated that dismissing foreign techniques as excessive or impractical often reflected ignorance rather than wisdom. American frontier culture began incorporating systematic evaluation of traditional knowledge systems instead of automatically privileging local practice over immigrant expertise. By 1860, structures throughout the Appalachian region displayed clear influence of Welsh mountain building traditions. Steep roof pitches, multiple overlap systems, and comprehensive waterproofing became standard features of quality construction rather than eccentric foreign innovations. The transformation represented a permanent improvement in regional building standards that saved countless lives and prevented immeasurable property damage during subsequent severe weather events. Morgan's legacy transcended individual building projects to influence an entire region's approach to construction quality and weather preparation. The Welsh immigrant who had been mocked as a fool for excessive preparation became recognized as a visionary whose traditional knowledge had elevated American frontier building standards to match the harsh realities of mountain weather patterns that periodically tested every aspect of human survival in unforgiving natural environments.